First tonight, the pace of diplomatic efforts to end the war in Ukraine appears to be slowing. In the latest sign of strains between the US and other allies, scheduled talks in London between American, European and Ukrainian negotiators have been downgraded. Reports suggest Ukraine is under US pressure to give up territory seized by Russia as part of a peace deal. Diplomats have gathered in the British capital to discuss a ceasefire in the three-year war, but with little clarity about where they're heading or where they'll succeed. The White House says President Trump is increasingly frustrated by the process. Mr. Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, travels to Moscow this week for his fourth meeting with President Putin. All this amid reports that Russia may be ready to halt its invasion along current front lines and give up some territorial ambitions in return for US recognition of Russian sovereignty over Crimea. President Zelensky has ruled out recognizing Crimea as Russian territory.
Ukrainians and the Russians are both going to have to give up some of the territory they currently own. There's going to have to be some territorial swaps. We've issued a very explicit proposal to both the Russians and the Ukrainians, and it's time for them to either say yes or for the United States to walk away from this process. We have engaged in an extraordinary amount of diplomacy, of on-the-ground work. We're going to see if the Europeans, the Russians, and the Ukrainians are ultimately able to get this thing over the finish line. Again, I feel pretty optimistic about it. I think everybody has been negotiating in good faith, but it's now time, I think, to take, if not the final step, one of the final steps, which is at a broad level, the parties saying, we're going to stop the killing, we're going to freeze the territorial lines at some level close to where they are today, and we're going to actually put in place the kind of long-term diplomatic settlement that hopefully will lead to long-term.
Тому що як тільки ми починаємо говорити про Крим,
as we start talking about Crimea, our sovereign territories, etc., we enter the format that Russia wants, a prolongation of the war, because it will not be possible to agree on everything quickly. Ukraine does not legally recognize the occupation of Crimea. There is nothing to talk about. It is outside our constitution. This is our territory. The territory of the people of Ukraine. We can't just say, why not? Give it to Russia. This will not happen.
чого не буде? Мені здається, що
Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials say a Russian drone attack on a bus has killed at least 9 people in the town of Marhanets across the river from the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The Ukrainians say the bus appears to have been deliberately targeted. Officials say it was carrying workers and that 42 others on board were wounded. Correspondents say the attack underlines the need for a truce. Well, for more on developments around Ukraine, let's speak now to the international affairs analyst, Dr. Laskiewicz, who joins me on the line from London. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's start with the latest bloodshed. At least 9 people killed in a Russian drone strike that hit a bus in the southern Ukrainian city of Marhanets this morning. And that follows a wave of airstrikes that targeted the country overnight. I mean, the front line of this war appears to be moving to areas where civilians reside.
Yes, the reason for that is that Russia, I think, is building up for another attack. It is waiting for America to pull out, and that in the time it's waiting, it's simply making these attacks, which, to be honest, don't appear to be even military attacks. They're just random attacks almost, just simply to keep the pressure on Ukraine, and it's not really serious in military terms. And however, it is of course extremely unpleasant for those concerned.
Indeed, and we understand that Presidents Putin and Zelensky have said they're open to direct talks, and both would be open to banning targeting civilian infrastructure. How close are we, if at all, to that actually happening?
I'm afraid I regard both sentences as PR, certainly from the Russian side. After all, there was supposed to be a ceasefire over Easter, and by all reports, it was never held. So therefore, this talk about banning civilian targets is, I think, just PR at present. Indeed, it is unlikely that any direct talks can take place because, for a start, Russia doesn't even recognize President Zelensky. And so, therefore, as a result, it's going to be hard to have direct talks in that sense. Moreover, Ukraine has made its position quite clear, and there doesn't appear to be much room for negotiation. So quite what the direct talks could do is a mystery. And in fact, to be honest, zero as far as I can see.
And London, where you are, Dr. Laskiewicz, was due to hold high-level talks today with the US, Europe and Ukraine. But this morning we learned that those talks have been downgraded. I mean, what do they mean by downgraded in this context?
Key point is the Americans, the big Americans in this sentence, Rubio and Witkoff, are not going to turn up. And therefore, the talks no longer are serious. They've been downgraded to merely meetings because there's nothing serious going to be said. The reason why they're not going to turn up is quite simple. They've already made their proposals. These proposals now are quite clearly set out, and it's up to, as they stated, Russia, Ukraine, and Europe to make up their minds about it. The talks, in this sense, have no sense for them. More interesting is why they're going to Moscow, because logically, if they're pulling out, then there's no more reason for them to go to Moscow than to London. The implication here is that Donald Trump, despite, if you like, Patsy, the comment made by on your clip previously, showing that the Americans are optimistic about these talks, the impression given here is that Donald Trump has made up his mind and is extremely doubtful the talks will go ahead. And therefore, the trip to Moscow is already, if you like, the first feelers about what's going to happen assuming the talks collapse. There's no other logical reason for them to go to Russia. And therefore, in this case, it would appear that Trump is going to do precisely as he stated, and J.D. Vance has incidentally underlined just recently today, they're going to pull out soon.
Right. So, I mean, would you say that this downgrading is a bad move from a European perspective, a step backwards?
See, not entirely, in the sense they've already laid out the Americans what they want. What is a step backwards for them is the fact they will go to Russia, as I said. Now, that's a disconcerting aspect. Had they merely stayed in the States and say, we've made our proposal, can you please decide? That would be another matter altogether. I think in that sense it's worrying, not so much to London as the Moscow visit. The other aspect here is that as things stand, Europe has made no formal reply, nor Ukraine, to the American proposals. I think this is also adding to Donald Trump's frustration in the sense that he's a businessman, likes to see things move fast and nothing's happening. Of course, Russia's not moving at all either, but that's scarcely surprising. And Zelensky has said he's not prepared to alter his terms at all. So therefore, I do believe that President Donald Trump has already half made up his mind, if not entirely, that things are going to be different by the end of this week.
And I mean, a strategic goal for Moscow, and I think you've mentioned this a couple of times in the past, is to reset relations with the US. I mean, in that regard, does Vladimir Putin need to be seen to make peace in some shape or form in Ukraine to satisfy President Trump?
Yes, I think that, to be quite honest, what is quite clear is that USA has given Russia a great deal, not only of territory, of prestige, and also is saying there will be business proposals, and Russia is quite pleased to go along with this. As far as I can see, that it's not President Putin which is holding up such terms, but of course President Zelensky, because from his point of view, this is a total sellout. His territory gone, very little in terms of guarantees, nothing on the table. In fact, a minerals deal which more or less is paying back America the money which actually, strictly speaking, America gave Ukraine. There's virtually very little in this proposal that President Zelensky wants to see. President Putin quite the opposite. And so Donald Trump has now got the impression that President Zelensky yet again is the break in all this. And the key point is, if America does leave, it will be a huge impact on the war. And we will be going back to a very dangerous situation, because if Russia wins, as it can win either by the peace proposals by Americans being implemented or by the Americans leaving, then we are possibly going to see an escalation of the war, which the Russians have indicated previously is possible and would fit in with my books, of course, namely that they will move on to another front. Please note also, militarily, Ukraine is bracing itself for another Russian invasion, because the Russians are massing their troops again.
Dr. Laskiewicz, thank you very much indeed. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is an international affairs analyst who was talking to me on the line there from London.